Welcome back. The Southern African Development Community's Extraordinary Summit of Heads of State and Government met to discuss the insurgency in Mozambique yesterday. The humanitarian situation in northern parts of Mozambique worsened, with terrorists taking up a scorched earth military strategy, vandalizing schools, hospitals, as well as critical infrastructure. With more details on this, I'm now joined by international news correspondent from Mozambique, that's Borges Nhamirre. Good morning, Borges, and welcome to Good Morning Namibia.
Good morning, thank you.
Please talk to us about the latest developments in northern Mozambique.
Well, the situation in northern Mozambique is that since July and August last year, Rwanda and SADC deployed military force to support Mozambican Defense Force to fight terrorism in northern of Mozambique. So that has changed the balance of fighting there. Before that, it was the insurgent chasing and killing military personnel, and now the situation has shifted. So now it is the government security force alongside with SADC and the Rwandan force chasing and killing the insurgents, destroying their base, seizing their equipment, and rescuing people who have been abducted, basically women and elderly and some children. So the situation is quite better now compared to a year ago. Even though the situation continues highly volatile, because we see that the insurgents they did split in small groups. So now they are attacking a second province beside of capital guard. This is Niassa province, which is a neighboring province. But also they have managed to cross the border and go to Tanzania, which is just crossing the Ruvuma River up the north of capital guard. So the situation continues very difficult, and it can help to understand why SADC keeps the mission on the ground.
Now, hearing you say that the situation is slightly better, we do know that since 2017, more than 1 million people had been displaced and more than 3,000 civilians killed. Do we have any indication of the full extent of what had happened?
Yeah, it's difficult to have the full understanding because the situation is very dynamic on the ground. But what we can make sure now is that we still have up of this, which 800,000 people have been displaced. The majority, like more than 80%, they continue living in so-called hosting families. So they don't have like ADP centers where they can get better conditions for life. So this is very difficult both to IDPs and to their relatives who are giving them householdings. There's a shortage of almost everything: food, clothing, and basic hygiene equipment. So this is very difficult to the local people. You will see that in this SADC summit yesterday, some countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe have contributed, have mobilized some kind of humanitarian assistance to local people. But we also have a United Nations agency in capital guard supporting. But you will imagine that in 4 years, having almost 1 million of IDPs, it's very difficult to manage the situation. So in terms of humanitarian situation, this is the most critical. Above all, we have children who have lost school for 4 years because school have been banned and they have been displaced for their village. We have women who are suffering some sexual abuse by local authority. We have people who have a kind of conflict of land conflict because people who came from other village seeking for refuge in another village are facing some kind of discrimination when they are looking for land for farming. So this is a situation very complex, which has not been reported by media in understanding way, but the situation is very there.
Now, being mindful of how complex the situation is, and also being mindful of how under and unreported the matter is and its impact on the region, some laypersons still don't understand why it was necessary for SADC to intervene. What do you make of SADC's response?
Well, it was completely necessary to SADC to intervene because above all, this is a regional problem located so far in the capital Gado. But even though we'll see that terrorism is a cross-border problem, The fighters were in Cabo Delgado. We have foreign fighters, the majority coming from Tanzania, but there are evidence that others come from South Africa and from different countries in Africa and in the region. So it's important the region to mobilize and try to settle the problem while it is still located in Cabo Delgado, not waiting for it to spread to other countries. And Mozambique is neighbored by 6 countries in the region. And from north to south, we have Tanzania, we have Malawi, we have Zimbabwe, we have South Africa, we have Swaziland, bordering Mozambique. So what does it mean? It means the situation from Mozambique will spread to the neighboring countries. Being the country with the majority of Muslim population, the next victim is likely. So it's very important to the region to mobilize and solve the problem. But another very important point to refer is that SADC, it's a development community organization, but also it has a defense pact, which consists in, if you attack one country, it means you are attacking the region. So this is happening today in Mozambique, could be happening in Tanzania or in Namibia, for example, which is a member state of SADC. So this is a very important move. And actually, this is a historical move by SADC, being there now for more than 6 months with own funds, trying to solve a global problem, which is terrorism. And the last thing to say is that terrorism is not a single country problem. Everywhere where we have terrorism, even in the United States, you will see that the countries tend to have a joint operation with others. You cannot fight terrorism alone because terrorism is a cross-border problem. If you fight them in Mozambique, they will escape to Tanzania, they will escape to Malawi, they will escape to South Africa, so on, so on, and so on. And if we look, for example, in the Lake Chad here in Africa, we'll see that the countries did mobilize to tackle together the problem of terrorism. If we look to Sahel, for example, so this problem of terrorism is never a single country problem.
Now, if one has regard for why it was important for SADC to intervene, please let's take stock of the successes of this intervention thus far.
Well, a lot has been done. Several terrorist bases have been destroyed. When I started this interview, I've said that before the military intervention by SADC and Rwanda, terrorists, they had occupied villages, for example, and towns. Their bases were untouchable. Mozambican force alone could not target the terrorists, who are very strong, and they include some foreign fighters, some coming from African countries, but other coming from Asia, like Yemen, for example. I'm talking about the country where there are clear evidence. So the arrival of foreign troops, the SADC troops, and the Rwandan troops as well, it helped to push back the terrorists. It helped to dislodge the terrorists from their military base in very close forests. In Mozambique, they brought new technology, they brought more experienced men, and the Mozambican army was already tired after 4 years of fighting terrorism. So the presence of foreign force was so important. The majority of the military bases have been destroyed. So now the terrorists are fighting without bases. So that is very important. That's a very important move. But even though the threat is not has not been neutralized yet, the terrorists are still working in a small group of 6 to 10 people attacking while they are running. The next time, what we expect to see is that the SADC should continue in Mozambique, and then this new time, which is trying to build peace, is more difficult, maybe more than the peace enforcement.
Thank you, Borges.
So far.
Thank you very much. Now, Rwanda is not part of SADC, we know that, and as a result was also not part of the extraordinary meeting yesterday in Malawi. But they have 1,000 troops fighting in Mozambique at the moment. Please briefly contextualize that for us.
2,000 actually. So now Rwanda has confirmed that they have 2,000 men and women in Cabo Delgado helping to fight insurgents. That has 2 different views. First of all, the agreement between Mozambique and Rwanda is not so clear. So we don't know for how long they're staying, what are their powers, what is so-called the state of force, which is different to SADC mission. The SADC mission is more transparent, while the Rwandan mission is very difficult. And also, they are not in the same district. Basically, terrorism in Cabo Delgado is in 7 district, and the Rwandese are in only 2 districts, in Palma and Musimba da Praia, which are the heart of terrorism, but also at the heart of LNG. So there are so many questions about what is the payment that Rwanda is going to get and who is paying the mission. While we're not talking about SADC, it's very clear that the contributing states are also funding the mission. To Rwanda, it's not clear who is funding. Rwanda itself say the government of Rwanda is funding the mission in Mozambique, but it's not clear because the mission is very expensive to a single state fund it for several months. So
Thank you,
there are
Borges.
more questions about Rwandese presence in Mozambique. Even though their presence is very important, they have assisted Mozambique to fight terrorism. They continue assisting, but it's important to make it clear what is the price. What is coming after the Rwandese presence in Mozambique? Basically, because Rwanda is not a neighboring state, but also is not a member of SADC.
Borges, we need to wrap up. Now, the world still finds itself in the middle of an Omicron-induced 4th wave of COVID-19. How is Mozambique coping with the pandemic? Very briefly, please.
Well, pandemic is another problem, but at this point I can say clearly that Mozambique has been focusing on fighting terrorism. So terrorism is a much bigger threat compared to COVID. Mozambican people are complying with the measure created by government to control the spread of the COVID. So now I think the worst problem of Mozambique is terrorism, which has created an humanitarian crisis in the capital guard, while pandemic is something also bad, but not the biggest problem of the country at this point.
Borges, thank you very much for this very informative conversation. Please be safe out there.
Thank you.
That was international news correspondent from Mozambique, Borges Nhamirre, talking to us about the situation in Mozambique. The lady who responds to the name of Ilago Shitatala is standing by with the news highlights at 7.